Hey guys, tonight we step into the candlelit hush of a medieval chapel where roses wither beneath heavy incense and you trembling in an itchy wool dress are about to marry a man you barely know, with an audience that includes your landlord, your cousin, and a chicken. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where romance is a footnote, marriage is a transaction, and your wedding night. Well, you probably won't survive this without psychological scarring. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You clutch a bouquet of wilted herbs, your palms sweating despite the chill. The chapel is damp, the stone floor scattered with hay and expectation. The priest chants in Latin, and you're not entirely sure if he just married you or cursed your crops. Beside you, your new husband looks pleased, or perhaps just smug. Either way, his breath smells like onions. In medieval Europe, weddings were rarely private. Marriages weren't about love. They were contracts, trades of land, livestock, social advantage. You might be 14 or 15. He might be 30 or older. The ceremony itself, quick, often informal, sometimes just two people declaring they were married in front of witnesses, no church required. That's called sponsalia per verba de presenti. And yes, it held up in court. Lucky you. What really mattered was not the vows, but what happened afterward. You probably already know where this is heading, but not just yet. First, let's talk about what's around your neck, the veil. More than just bridal fashion, it's a medieval symbol of being given or covered. It meant you were no longer an individual. You were property passed from father to husband, like a particularly fragile goat. The priest blesses the bed, the house, and if he's thorough, your womb. Sometimes he even throws in a fertility prayer, just to cover all bases. One 12th century priest famously warned couples not to have intercourse standing up, because, quote, it confuses the angels. Historians still argue whether that was metaphorical or just very specific. Now you may be wondering, did the bride and groom know each other well? Often, no. This was matchmaking, by ledger, not love letter. You could be marrying someone you've seen once, perhaps from a distance. If he has all his teeth, that's a bonus. Meanwhile, everyone in the village knows it's your wedding night. There are whispers, nudges, even bets. One 14th century chronicler in France joked that a town crier would sometimes announce a noble couple's retirement to the bedchamber as if it were a jousting match with even less armor. And speaking of armor, you're unarmed. Not just emotionally, but literally. Your bridal dress has no pockets, no protection, and absolutely no escape hatches. At this point, you're probably thinking, okay, at least the wedding is done. But the real ordeal, it hasn't even started yet. Let's drift to your dowry chest. It's sitting in the corner of your new room, creaking under the weight of linen spices and dread. Inside, along with that scratchy embroidered pillow your aunt insisted you bring, is your marriage contract. In some regions, it's a legal safeguard. In others, it's just parchment affirming your value in coin cows and childbearing potential. By now, your maid, or maybe your mother-in-law, is gently, very helpfully, reminding you to smile. No crying, she says, or he'll think you're barren. That's not superstition. Some believed tears on a wedding night were omens of infertility. Others thought it invited ghosts. Yes, literal ghosts. In Brittany, new brides were warned to hang iron scissors under the bed to keep away jealous spirits. But the ghost you should really fear, the looming presence of expectation. In noble households, failure to consummate the marriage meant it could be annulled. That meant your family would lose everything they'd traded for your hand. There are actual records of families suing the husband for not doing his duty and vice versa. One poor guy even had to perform before a panel of doctors to prove his capabilities. Imagine that performance, review, and you. You're expected to be meek, virginal obedient, and mysteriously knowledgeable about how to make this night go well. No pressure. A flickering torch signals the end of the feast. The guests begin their procession. You are led not gently toward the bridal bed. The floor is cold, your legs unsteady, and somewhere behind you, someone is singing a bawdy song about cabbages. You suspect this was not covered in the Book of Hours. You cross the threshold into your new home, your new life, and possibly your worst night. And the bed. It's not what you'd call romantic. Just a wooden frame, stuffed straw mattress, maybe a woolen cover. If you're lucky, there's a curtain to block the prying eyes. If not, well, don't worry. There are more eyes coming. Let's pause there. Not because the story stops, but because the real terror is just beginning. You're standing at the edge of the bed now, staring at it like it might bite. Honestly, it might. The straw mattress creaks like it's trying to warn you. There's a faint smell of beeswax sweat and onions again. Somehow they've followed you here too. Your new husband is somewhere behind you, likely drunk, likely undressing with all the finesse of a sack of flour falling downstairs. And you're not even undressed. Not yet. That's someone else's job. In many medieval households, especially among the nobility, undressing the bride was a communal ritual. Yes, communal. As in multiple people helping, guiding, watching. Your friends and female relatives might be tasked with unbuttoning your gown, unpinning your veil, and placing you, gently, though more often practically, into the marriage bed. This tradition, sometimes referred to as the bedding ceremony, was as theatrical as it was uncomfortable. Entire communities participated. There are documented cases of peasants shoving couples into bed while singing rowdy songs. In noble circles, it could be more restrained priests offering blessings, mothers whispering warnings, fathers turning conveniently away. But it was never private. Some cultures took it even further. In parts of Scandinavia and the Germanic world, brides were actually paraded to the marital bed with song laughter, and sometimes a torchlit procession. Everyone would clap and cheer as the bedroom door was closed. And by closed, we mean barely shut. Sometimes there was no door at all. And if you thought all this was just rural gossip, consider this King Charles II of England centuries later still had a bedding ceremony with full court attendance. Which really makes your uncomfortable family dinners look tame, doesn't it? But you're not royalty. You're just you under the covers now. Heart thudding in your chest like a rabbit thumping warning. And there's still a crowd, because here's the real kicker. In some traditions, witnesses, yes, actual humans would remain in the room to observe that the marriage had been properly consummated. 2 witnesses, often men, would stand in the corners of the room, trying not to look directly at anything yet required to hear or see just enough to legally testify that yes, the deed was done. And while this wasn't common everywhere, it wasn't unheard of either. In 16th century France, noble marriages were sometimes consummated before the court, with bishops, nobles, and relatives offering commentary, like it was an Olympic event. Historians still argue whether some of these accounts were exaggerated for drama or satire, but even the fact that it was possible is enough to make you want to fake a stomachache. And yet, this moment, awkward, humiliating, deeply personal, was considered sacred. To the church, consummation completed the marriage in the eyes of God. Without it, the whole union could be declared null. That's why people were so interested in whether you went through with it. You weren't just sealing a love story. You were sealing contracts, politics, and often land inheritance. And if you're wondering how you're supposed to feel during all this, the church had opinions. Medieval sermons advised wives to submit joyfully, but also not too joyfully, lest they be accused of lechery. There was even a common teaching that women should endure the act as a duty while staring at the ceiling and reciting the Lord's Prayer. Romantic Rite One fringe practice noted in a few 14th century Spanish texts included pre-coital confession, in which a priest would give absolution to the couple for what they were about to do, just in case. Because nothing gets you in the mood like guilt and Latin. Let's also talk about clothing. You might be wearing a simple shift meant to keep your modesty intact while still allowing access. These chemises of virtue were often white, symbolizing purity. But if the husband didn't believe it, well, that's a problem. In some households, the marriage bed had special sheets for the occasion, white linen to catch blood, not because of hygiene, but as proof of virginity. If the sheet showed no stain, the bride's honor and her family's reputation was in jeopardy. And no, it didn't matter if you were nervous or tired or just not bleeding. Medieval medicine didn't account for nuance. If there was no proof, there were whispers, sometimes louder than whispers. One German case in 1327 saw a bride paraded through the town with a sign declaring her false. Her dowry was seized. Her family was shamed, all because of a sheet. There were some workaround attempts. Quirky midwives, ever the heroes, sometimes hid a small animal's blood under the mattress to smear the linens, a sort of crimson insurance policy. You laugh, but if that goat didn't die for your dignity, who would? And in some rare cases, the marriage could be tested by clergy. If a couple was childless after several years, they might be subject to church investigations, physical exams, even bizarre rituals. One English monk in the 1200s wrote of a fertility prayer involving ground herbs, swan's feathers, and a midnight chant. That's either medicine or a very elaborate excuse for insomnia. By now the crowd has left, the fire has dimmed, and the noises from the feasting hall have faded into distant burps and snores. It's just the two of you now. You barely know him. He barely knows how to untie your shift. You wish someone had written a guidebook, one that wasn't penned by a celibate monk. You shift under the scratchy wool blanket, trying not to wince at the mattress springs, which, by the way, don't exist. Just straw and bugs, and the soft sigh of disappointment. And that's the strange thing. For many brides, this night was more than just awkward. It was frightening, disorienting. A moment you're told to cherish, but left to endure. And as your husband finally lies down beside you, smelling strongly of ale and ambition, You close your eyes, not out of desire, but out of hope that this will end soon. You are now a wife, but not yet safe. That part comes later. If it comes at all, there's a soft knock on the wooden door. You're half asleep, half aware, lying still beneath the scratchy wool blanket. The room smells of burnt tallow and damp wood. Your husband snores beside you, his breath sour from too much mead. You thought the worst was over. But the knock comes again. You sit up the linen shift clinging to your skin. The door creaks open just a little and two familiar faces peer in. Witnesses. It's not a joke, not some late-night toast to your new life. It's protocol. In parts of medieval Europe, particularly in aristocratic and royal households, the consummation of a marriage was not just assumed, it was required to be witnessed, or at least attested to, and not just by anyone. These witnesses were typically appointed noblemen, matrons, servants, priests, people of status and strong stomachs. In some cases, they didn't just confirm that the couple entered the bedroom they stayed until they were sure things were moving along. You might be thinking, surely that's exaggerated. No one would actually stand there. But court records from the 12th to 15th centuries suggest otherwise. In one infamous Burgundian case, 2 chamberlains were assigned to hide behind a curtain to verify the act. Another account describes how 4 witnesses stood respectfully by as the newlyweds disrobed and united. Respectfully, that's the word they used. You can practically hear the awkward coughing. Historians still argue whether such moments were mostly symbolic, just the couple being seen entering the bedchamber together, or whether people truly stuck around to see it through. The truth likely varied by region and status, but the fear of being watched, that was universal. And here's the catch. If there were doubts about the marriage later, like disputes over legitimacy, inheritance, or whether the bride had truly been a virgin, these witnesses could be called to testify in court. That's right, your sex life, reduced to sworn testimony. The logic behind it, property power and paternity, especially in noble families where bloodlines were everything. A child born into a marriage was only considered legitimate if the marriage was consummated, and someone credible had either seen or verified it. Which brings us to one of the stranger customs of all the mock consummation. In some regions, especially in France and England, high-status couples participated in symbolic rituals instead of actual observation. The couple would lie in bed, fully clothed, while guests entered the room, offered blessings, maybe sang a bawdy song, or threw nuts. Yes, nuts, and then departed, leaving the pair to their privacy. It sounds more manageable, right? Until you realize that if something went wrong, say the husband had performance issues, or the bride resisted, the whole town would know by morning. This was not a night for mistakes. In some towns, the bride and groom were even offered a ceremonial meal in bed under the watchful eyes of the household. Trays of dried figs, candied almonds, and fertility herbs would be served, meant to inspire success. You're supposed to be intimate while Aunt Mildred watches you chew roasted duck and tries not to say, "Make sure he finishes." It's enough to make you consider becoming a nun. But remember, you can't just not go through with it. Failure to consummate could void the entire marriage. There are plenty of records where women were sent back to their fathers after unsuccessful wedding nights. Worse, a man might claim you were cold or inhospitable, legally blaming you for his own shortcomings. and the court, rarely in your favor. Let's take the strange case of Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of King Henry VII. Married at 12, she gave birth at 13 and never had another child again. Historians debate whether her traumatic first childbirth damaged her permanently. Some suggest she refused further intimacy for the rest of her life. Others whisper that her later marriages were in name only. Whatever the truth, her wedding night was not something she ever wanted to repeat. Meanwhile, in less noble households, things were simpler, but no less awkward. In villages across the British Isles and Northern Europe, communities still held onto the rough music tradition, also called charivari. After the wedding, neighbors would gather outside the couple's home, banging pots, blowing horns, and singing raucous songs. Not to celebrate, to pressure. They would only stop once the couple had a hymn completed the event. Imagine trying to focus while the neighbors chant rhymes about rutabagas and goats outside your window. It's like being serenaded by a nightmare. And yet, all of this was considered normal, to be watched, to be judged, to be expected to perform intimacy like a duty. It was not only your responsibility, it was your obligation. And this expectation followed you everywhere. Even in art and literature, brides were rarely portrayed as joyful. Medieval illuminations show them pale, stiff, sometimes clutching their hands in prayer. It's not hard to see why. This wasn't the beginning of romance. It was the beginning of vulnerability. If you're lucky, your husband is gentle. Perhaps he understands that you're afraid. Perhaps he whispers something kind. Or perhaps, like many, he sees this night as his right. And you lie back. You breathe shallowly. You hope it's over soon. Not just tonight, but this entire weight of expectation. You hope you can survive it with some shred of dignity intact. Because even if no one stayed in the room to watch you tonight, they'll still talk about it tomorrow. The first thing you see when you open your eyes is the sheet. It's rumpled heavy with sleep and sweat. But that's not what your heart focuses on. You sit up, slow hands, trembling. You tug it gently toward yourself. And there it is, the stain. Tiny, barely visible in the morning light, but unmistakably red. In the Middle Ages, virginity was currency, not a myth, not a metaphor. It was proof, evidence, a blood mark on linen to show the world you were pure, untouched, worthy. It didn't matter if it was your first time or your 50th. What mattered was what could be seen. If you bled, good. If not, bad. Very bad. You hear the footsteps before you see her. The mother-in-law. She doesn't knock. She never knocks. She lifts the sheet before you can speak. Eyes narrowed, lips tight. A slow nod. Then she leaves, clutching it like a prized relic. In some cultures, the bloodied wedding sheet would be displayed to guests the morning after, hung out. The window stretched across a line, or passed from hand to hand, as family members cheered or gossiped. It sounds grotesque, because it was, but it was also legal protection. In parts of Italy, Spain, and Eastern Europe, a visible stain on the wedding sheet served as irrefutable proof that the marriage had been consummated. This meant your dowry was secure. You couldn't be sent back. Your husband couldn't annul the marriage on claims of fraud. That one red blotch could be the difference between survival and social ruin. And yet this was an incredibly flawed system, because many women don't bleed their first time, especially if they were older active, or if the act itself was rushed clumsy or terrifying. Historians still argue whether the obsession with blood came from ancient Roman customs or medieval theological anxieties. Either way, it was wrong, but brutally enforced. And if there wasn't blood, that's where things got cruel. Some families kept professional witnesses, usually older women who were paid to inspect the sheets. If no stain was found, they might accuse the bride of deceit. Some towns even held public trials where the couple had to defend what happened in bed. Yes, public. Imagine standing in front of your neighbors explaining why you didn't bleed. In one chilling case from 15th century France, a girl was returned to her father 3 days after her wedding, with a letter that read simply, "No proof. Unsuitable." Her family lost the dowry. She was considered spoiled. Her prospects gone. And here's where it gets stranger. To avoid disgrace, some families faked the blood. Midwives smeared chicken livers under the bed. Sisters crushed berries onto the linens before sunrise. One particularly creative tale from southern Italy describes a bride who pricked her finger and dotted the sheet in a neat, artistic pattern. No one questioned it. In fact, the mother-in-law bragged about how productive the night must have been. Was this deception? Of course, but also resistance. In a world where a young woman's worth was reduced to a bed, a sheet, and someone else's definition of pure trickery became survival. There are whispers, half-remembered folk tales of grandmothers teaching their girls how to stage a stain, how to save themselves from shame with a goat's bladder and a good poker face. Meanwhile, the men faced no such scrutiny. If the groom couldn't perform, well, that could be explained. Bad nerves, too much wine, a passing illness. There were even potions and remedies sold by traveling monks and herbalists to fix such problems. But a bride who didn't bleed, that was seen as a moral failure. Let that sink in. There are also darker stories. Stories of husbands who, embarrassed by the lack of blood, accused their wives of dishonesty. Some demanded public inspection by midwives, intimate, invasive, and humiliating. Others used it as justification for annulment or for taking a mistress. And in rare but chilling instances, violence was used to make the bride bleed, forcing the narrative to match the expectation. In Northern Europe, particularly in rural regions, a bizarre counter-custom emerged: the blooded shirt. Instead of the sheet, the groom would rise in the morning, wear the marked undershirt proudly through the village, and drink with his friends as they toasted his masculinity. He was seen as victorious, triumphant. She was seen as conquered. One scholarly debate that still swirls around this period concerns how deeply symbolic this obsession with virginity truly was. Some historians argue it wasn't just about purity, but about property ensuring heirs were truly legitimate. Others suggest it was religious anxiety, purity of the soul represented by purity of the body, and a few fringe theorists point to ancient fertility cults where blood signified sacrifice and renewal. Maybe it was all of the above, maybe none of it. But here's the strange paradox. Once the blood was shown, once you were proven, once the sheet was cleanly dirtied, your value shifted. You were no longer a bride. You were a wife, no longer a maiden, now a vessel. You belong now, not to yourself, but to the system. And now you dress quietly. Your stomach aches, whether from nerves or something more. Outside, the village stirs. Chickens squawk. Feet shuffle on dirt paths. Life goes on. But you are not the same girl who entered this bed last night. You can't be. Your husband snores louder, arm flopped across the bed, like he's claimed a territory. You tuck your shift into your belt and step outside. You see the sheet already hanging from the window. The wind snaps it like a banner, red against white. The neighbors nod. Some smile. Some just stare. They don't need to ask how your night went. The sheet already told them everything. The first time she speaks to you is over porridge. Your new mother-in-law sits across the table spooning mush into her mouth with the confidence of someone who owns the house, the food, and by extension you. Her eyes never leave yours. Not even when she says calmly and without irony, "Keep your knees warm. Cold thighs make cold wombs." You blink. She doesn't. This is your morning after tutorial, led by the woman who raised the man snoring in your bed. Now that you're a wife, you are her project, her clay, to mold her investment, to protect her silent competitor. And like many mothers-in-law of the medieval world, she is terrifyingly efficient. Her first job, making sure you're fertile. Her second, making sure you behave. And her third, letting you know in every unspoken gesture that you are not entirely trusted. Welcome to the medieval household where mother-in-laws were often the unofficial supervisors of marriage. If you lived under the same roof, and many did, you would be monitored closely. Not just for propriety, but for signs of pregnancy, signs of rebellion, or signs you were failing to satisfy your husband. She might even check the laundry, just in case the sheet had been swapped. In some noble homes, the mother-in-law had her own apartments, but her influence crept into yours. She chose your servants. She advised your diet, no onions. They stir the blood. She reminded you when it was a holy day and when it was a fertile one. And most chillingly, she often decided when it was time to try again for a child. You're not surprised. After all, she's the one who arranged this marriage, or negotiated the dowry, or at the very least, gave a nod of approval that decided your future. She might have even been present at your wedding night, a shadow in the corner, offering advice in a whisper you couldn't ignore. And now she's here, pouring goat's milk and giving you unsolicited marital tips between sips. "Don't lie on your left side," she says. "That's the devil's direction. Blocks the womb." You nod, you smile, you don't ask questions. That would be rude. The truth is, she likely means well in her way. Childbearing was not just a family goal. It was a spiritual obligation tied into your worth as a wife and your place in the household. She knows what happens to women who don't conceive. She's seen daughters-in-law sent home in disgrace, whispered about in markets, replaced before the ink dried on the annulment papers. So she teaches you. At least she thinks she is. One fringe manuscript from 13th century Saxony, likely written by a midwife, lists mother-in-law advice alongside medicinal cures, treating both with equal skepticism. Lines like, "Give her warm ale and boiled fennel to open the womb and keep her from singing when alone." You wonder if your own mother-in-law contributed. What's worse is that she has authority more than you. In many cases, she could speak on your behalf over your protests. If you complained of mistreatment, she might decide you were being emotional. If you expressed fear or disinterest, she might scold you for being cold. Cold women were always suspect. And let's not forget, she raised him. So if he's impatient, she might say boys will be boys. If he drinks too much, he works hard. If he strays, and here's the crux she might already know about the mistresses. Yes, mistresses. We'll come to those soon. But for now, let's stay here, trapped in this dynamic between two women, one who just married in and one who never left. It's not always hostile. Sometimes there's comfort in her experience, warmth in her stories, and silent solidarity when she touches your hand at supper and says, "The first is always hardest." But often it's performance. You're being trained. How to speak to your husband, when to laugh at his jokes, how to dress at Mass, how to remove lice without ruining your hair, how to arrange your stomach so that the baby will be clever, and when to keep your mouth shut. Some young wives tried to rebel. They stayed quiet, did things their own way. One documented case from Flanders tells of a girl who secretly continued reading poetry even after being told it would stir her blood. Her mother-in-law found the pages and burned them in the hearth, then accused her of selfishness and unnatural joy. Unnatural joy, as it turns out, was a serious red flag in a bride. Historians still debate the role of older women in reinforcing patriarchal systems. Were they victims too, just passing down the lessons they were forced to learn? Or were they enforcers, choosing power over empathy? The truth lies somewhere in between. Every village had a woman like her, and every young bride walked the tightrope of pleasing her. Sometimes you dream of going home, back to your mother, back to afternoons weaving at the fire or running barefoot behind the herb cart, but home is gone. You belong here now, under this roof, under her eye. You finish your porridge. She pushes a small pouch toward you, dried nettle leaves and crushed wormwood. "Drink this," she says, on the third day after bleeding. Keeps the womb warm. Opens the belly. You don't ask what happens if it doesn't. Instead, you smile again. You fold the pouch into your apron, and you begin to learn how to survive not just your husband. Two, you hear her before you see her. A low giggle, the unmistakable whisper of silk skirts. A moment later, a flash of perfume, not yours, drifts through the corridor like a warning. You freeze, clutching your basket of laundry, and then she appears. Her hair is too loose. Her dress is too fine. Her eyes linger too long on the door to your husband's room. The mistress. In the Middle Ages, fidelity wasn't exactly a two-way street. While women were expected to remain loyal, chaste, and entirely dedicated to their husbands, men were given far more leeway, especially noblemen. And so while you sit quietly embroidering names for children who don't exist yet, he might be enjoying the company of someone who isn't you. And the worst part, it's completely legal. Concubinage, keeping a mistress in addition to a wife, was common. Expected even. While the church officially frowned on it, enforcement was selective. A nobleman might be scolded in confession for his extramarital indulgences, but unless it disrupted the social order or produced a scandal, he was rarely punished. Mistresses especially, those kept openly, often lived in the same household or nearby lodgings. They received gifts, fine clothes, and, yes, your husband's attention. They laughed freely, moved confidently, and didn't have to live under the eye of his mother. And you were still recovering from a wedding night that felt more like a performance review than a celebration. There's a biting irony in all of this. Despite all the emphasis placed on your virginity, your obedience, your loyalty, you are now sharing your husband and no one seems particularly shocked about it. One historical record from 14th century France tells of a nobleman who installed his mistress 2 rooms away from his wife. When questioned by the bishop, he simply replied, "I am fulfilling all duties with both." He wasn't excommunicated, he was promoted. Historians still argue whether this double standard was driven more by culture or necessity. Some claim it was about ensuring legitimate heirs through marriage while still indulging personal desires elsewhere. Others suggest it was about control of women's bodies, of their reputations, of their worth. But fringe scholars have noted something curious. In some households, mistresses weren't just tolerated, they were respected, especially if they bore children. Those children, while technically illegitimate, could still inherit titles or property in certain kingdoms, which meant a mistress with a healthy son could suddenly become very important. And what about you? You were expected to be gracious, to smile, to host the feast, while she sat beside him whispering something that made him laugh harder than he ever did at your embroidery jokes. Some wives retaliated. There are stories, quiet ones, of poisoned teas, tampered perfumes, sharp pins left in shared beds, but more often the response was silence. The kind of silence that weighs down a room like heavy smoke. You might think, why didn't women just leave? Because they couldn't. Marriage was binding, legally, spiritually, socially. A woman who left her husband, even for infidelity, could be cast out, stripped of her dowry, her name, her safety. Some ran anyway. We'll get to them later. But most stayed because the alternative was worse. Still, the pain didn't go away. In one particularly haunting account from 15th century England, a noblewoman wrote in her prayer journal, "He is hers by desire, mine by duty. May God forgive us both." Her words were copied by nuns centuries later as an example of quiet endurance, or possibly quiet despair. There was also the social insult of comparison. Mistresses were often younger, freer, unconcerned with the politics of dinner arrangements or linen inspections. They didn't have to organize fast-day meals or negotiate with the steward over barley quotas. They could just be. And yes, sometimes they loved him, which might be the cruelest cut of all. There's even folklore surrounding the rivalry between wife and mistress. In parts of Germany, it was believed that a wife's soul could be trapped in a mirror if she stared at her rival too long with envy. In France, a charm was sold in markets that promised to turn the eye of man from the flower, not meant for him. Spoiler, it didn't work. But sometimes the dynamic was even more twisted. There are cases, rare but real, where mistresses and wives lived under the same roof, sharing the same kitchen, occasionally sharing the same bed. In some polygamous-leaning regions or fringe religious sects, this was justified with scripture dreams or divine visions. You, of course, are not invited into those decisions. You are informed of them. And if you think this was a noble problem, only think again. Among peasants, infidelity existed too. The difference was that it rarely involved mistresses in gowns, more likely a serving girl, a neighbor's daughter someone met at the market. But the pain, the betrayal, the impossibility of justice, just as sharp. And it wasn't just about love or sex. It was about power. A mistress could influence your husband's decisions. She could sway him against your brother in court. She could whisper doubts about your fertility. She could have your maid reassigned. She could make you feel small, invisible. And you were told to wait just pray, to trust that if you did everything right, you would be rewarded with affection. But in the dark, when the torches burn low, and you hear his footsteps skipping your door, heading toward hers, you learn something more ancient than any prayer. In this world, being a wife is not the same as being loved. You kneel on the cold stone floor of the chapel, your hands pressed tightly together, lips barely moving. You're not praying for happiness, not for love, not even for health. You're praying for consent to matter. Because here's the truth that nobody says aloud once you marry in medieval Europe: your consent becomes optional. The church says marriage is sacred, that it must be entered into freely, that the union must be mutual, spiritual, blessed. But after the vows are said, after the sheet is stained, after the dowry is paid, the church's concern begins to fade, and yours becomes irrelevant. Marital rape, as we understand it today, didn't exist in law, not in practice. A husband had legal and spiritual dominion over his wife's body, a right reinforced by theologians' lords, and even your confessor. You were expected to submit, not just once, not just on the wedding night, always. A 13th century priest's manual advises, if a wife refuses her husband, she sins doubly against him and against God's design for fruitfulness. Charming bedtime reading. And if she said no, if she cried, resisted, begged, that wasn't considered violence. That was considered defiance, something to be corrected, possibly with a sermon, possibly with a beating. Yes, that too was legal. Under medieval law in many European regions, a man could physically discipline his wife provided he didn't kill her or maim her permanently. The logic was that she was under his care and correction like a child, or a servant, or a particularly delicate mule. And the church. It didn't condone cruelty, but it also didn't intervene much. One bishop wrote that a husband should guide his wife gently but firmly, as Christ guides his church. Another suggested mildly that beatings should be done with discretion. Historians still argue over how often these laws were enforced or ignored or wielded like clubs. But the fact that they existed tells you everything. You were bound not just by marriage, but by silence. There's a bitter fringe tale from 14th century Wales where a young wife was brought before a bishop for resisting her husband's advances. She claimed illness. He claimed rebellion. The bishop's verdict: she was made to carry a wooden yoke through the town, wearing a sign that read, "A cold hearth is no home." She never resisted again. Your home is warm, but that warmth feels dangerous now, like a fire that might turn if you stop feeding it. You rise from prayer, your knees aching, the cold seeping up into your belly. You glance at the carved altar and wonder if God hears women differently, or if he's just very busy. Back at the manor, the conversation continues. You sit quietly while your husband debates village politics. You serve wine while the steward jokes about wives who only lie down for saints' days. You smile when the merchant's daughter asks if you've had luck, yet code for pregnancy. And you don't say what's really on your mind, that your body doesn't feel like yours anymore. It belongs to duty, to legacy, to expectation, and most of all, to him. Even when you are exhausted, even when your thighs ache from riding to market, even when your back burns from scrubbing rushes, you're expected to lie down, smile, conceive. And if you don't, you're the one who is questioned, never him. There's a common practice in medieval England called churching. After childbirth, a woman is ritually purified in the church, blessed for surviving, welcomed back into spiritual community. But there's a cruel irony to it. Because if you don't conceive, don't bear children, you are seen as somehow impure, even useless. A wife who cannot produce heirs becomes a ghost in her own household, present but ignored, necessary but disappointing. One noblewoman in 15th century Castile wrote that her husband referred to her as the barren gate. She never gave him a son, only stillborn girls. Eventually, he took a younger mistress. She moved into a side chamber and was instructed not to disturb him unless summoned. This was not unique. This was expected. And in many cases, if you could not or would not perform, your husband had the legal right to petition for annulment. He could argue that you were cursed or cold or bewitched. If the church agreed, your marriage could be dissolved. Your dowry might be seized, your name disgraced. Some women turned to remedies, herbs, prayers, relics. Others turned to saints. Saint Margaret of Antioch was especially popular protector of women in childbirth, patroness of the swollen and sorrowful. Her statue was worn smooth by the kisses of desperate fingers. One fringe story tells of a woman in Hungary who prayed so hard to Saint Margaret that she fainted during Mass. When she awoke, the priest declared it a sign. She conceived 2 months later. Probably a coincidence. But in the Middle Ages, hope mattered more than reason. Meanwhile, consent remained a fading echo in the background. You do what you're told, not because you're weak, but because you have no choices. And the choices you do have, they come with cost. Silence buys survival. Obedience buys shelter. Subtlety is your only sword. There's a game you play now. You pretend headaches. You time your prayers to twilight. You say you're fasting. You say you're bleeding. You lie. Because it's the only way to say no in a world that doesn't let you. And even then, it doesn't always work. You lie in bed facing the wall, counting the cracks in the plaster. Each one, a reason to endure, to survive, to wait. Because maybe next time it won't hurt as much. Because maybe next time he won't notice your tears. Because maybe someday you'll be more than a vessel. The trunk is too heavy for you to lift alone. You kneel beside it instead, pressing your palm to the carved lid. It's oak, rough-stained, dented by years of use, but it holds everything that matters. Your linens, your ribbons, your combs, and most importantly, your dowry papers. This is the part no one sang songs about. No minstrels praised it by firelight. But it ruled your life as surely as any vow or saint. The dowry, the price paid to make you a wife. In medieval Europe, a dowry wasn't just a bundle of coins or a few sacks of grain. It was a transaction, a literal price tag attached to your marriage. Your father paid it to your husband or his family in exchange for you being fed, clothed, and kept. And whether that amount was modest or grand, its shadow followed you into the bridal bed. And that shadow grew deeper if the wedding night went poorly. Here's how it worked. If the marriage was consummated, and all the proof see blood-stained sheets, neighborly witnesses, awkward conversations was in place, the dowry was sealed, locked in. The husband couldn't return you to your family without a scandal, and more importantly, without losing his money. But if that consummation didn't happen, or wasn't proven, he could walk away. Dowry annulment clauses existed all over Europe. In Florence, for example, a groom who discovered his wife wasn't a virgin or claimed she couldn't fulfill her wifely duties could send her home and demand the dowry back. And if her family couldn't pay debts, humiliation, lawsuits, sometimes worse. In one case, recorded in 1321, a bride from a wealthy Genoese family was returned after 3 days. The groom's father claimed she was uncooperative. No more details given. Her father refused to repay the dowry. A brawl broke out between the families. 2 servants were killed. The woman sent to a convent, her only crime disappointing the marriage contract. And here's the cruel twist. Even if you did everything right, your dowry could still betray you. Because once it was handed over, it became your husband's property. Legally. Entirely. He could invest it, spend it, gamble it, use it to fund a merchant voyage or buy new horses. And you had no say. It was your future, and it belonged to someone else now. The church tried to enforce fairness. Canon law required husbands to provide a mourning gift, a token or sum, given the day after the wedding, meant to recognize the wife's new status. In theory, it offered protection. In reality, it was often forgotten, ignored, or replaced with a nice loaf of bread. There were regional differences, of course. In Byzantium, dowries were massive ceremonial, often including silk spices, furniture, even servants. In the Islamic regions of Al-Andalus, a reverse dowry system existed called mahr, where the groom gave money to the bride herself, a rare moment of agency. In Jewish communities, marriage contracts, ketubah, spelled out financial protections in careful ink. But for most Christian women in medieval Europe, your dowry was a ticket in and a trap. Your in-laws judged you by it. If it was generous, they smiled politely and gave you nicer porridge. If it was small, they reminded you. Often. One Catalan wife in the 1400s was nicknamed Halfpenny by her husband's family to her face. And what if your husband died? Well, that's where things got even messier. Widows had to fight for their dowries back. You'd think it would automatically return to you. But no. Often your in-laws would try to keep it, claiming it was spent, invested, or simply forgotten. You might have to go to court, pay a lawyer, beg a bishop. Some widows won. Many didn't. One particularly heart-wrenching case from Bohemia tells of a woman whose husband died in battle. She asked for her dowry chest back. His brother claimed she'd never been fully married and burned the contract. She ended her days begging outside the church where she was wed. And then there was the dowry trap no one warned you about. If your family was poor, they might have taken loans to provide your dowry. Loans with steep interest. Sometimes even pledging land or future harvests. So while you were dancing in your veil, your parents were quietly selling off the cow. Or worse, indebting your younger siblings. You weren't just a bride. You were a financial burden disguised in lace. Some women tried to rewrite this story. There are records of cunning mothers who wrote dowry clauses into contracts protecting their daughters. Shall not be spent without mutual consent. Shall be returned in full upon widowhood. In a few cases, the women themselves dictated terms wealthy heiresses who used their dowries as leverage. Marry me, and I bring a fleet. Anger me, and I take it back. But these were rare exceptions. Most brides just prayed their husband wouldn't gamble it away, prayed they'd produce a child before he considered annulment, prayed they'd be widowed, not abandoned, because widows kept some rights. Discarded wives, almost none. You touch the chest again, tracing the iron clasp. Inside is the promise your parents made, the price they paid, and the pressure now resting on your womb like a stone. You wake in the dark to the sound of your own breathing. quick, shallow, afraid. Then comes the second sound, a low moan from deep within your belly. It's begun. You double over, hands pressed to your thighs as the pain coils tight. This is it. No turning back. No one told you it would feel like this. You thought childbirth would be hard. You didn't think it would feel like dying. But here you are. The fire in the hearth has burned low. Your mother-in-law is shouting down the hall. Footsteps thud on stairs. The midwife is coming. The pain doesn't wait. Welcome to the medieval experience of childbirth, where there is no medicine, no anesthesia, and very little mercy. You lie back on the rush-stuffed mattress, sweat dripping from your temples. A carved piece of wood is shoved into your mouth to bite, to keep you from screaming too loudly. Noise, they say, invites demons. Or worse, neighbors. There are 2 women by your side now. Your mother-in-law and the midwife, a figure equal parts. Healer, priestess, and battlefield medic. She rubs your belly with oil made from crushed herbs, fennel, mugwort, sometimes poppy. If you're lucky, she knows what she's doing. If you're really lucky, she's seen this go well before. You try to breathe. The pain returns in waves. Your legs shake. The room spins. This is not just a birth. This is a test of survival. In the Middle Ages, childbirth was the most dangerous event of a woman's life. Some estimates say that 1 in 5 women died giving birth. 1 in 5. And that doesn't count those who were crippled, infected, or permanently damaged afterward. Historians still debate the exact numbers. Records vary wildly between regions, but all agree medieval childbirth was terrifying. There were no doctors for women like you. Physicians were expensive and male, and most viewed female anatomy as mysterious, even dangerous. One 14th century text describes the womb as a hungry mouth that must be kept busy, or it devours the soul. That's not science. That's a panic attack in Latin. So instead, you rely on midwives, women trained by experience, superstition, and inherited knowledge. They bring talismans, prayer-salted cloth, and sometimes amulets meant to keep death at bay. Some midwives tie red threads around your wrists to protect you from evil spirits. Others place iron under the bed. A particularly grim custom in the Alps called for burying a live mouse under the hearth before labor began to draw the pain downward. You don't ask. You just try to survive. And here comes the next wave. You scream this time. The wood slips from your mouth. Your mother-in-law crosses herself. The midwife says, "Not yet. Don't push." You want to kill her. And then between contractions, the room stills. Someone lights a candle. The midwife leans close to your ear and whispers a prayer to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patroness of childbirth. According to legend, Margaret was swallowed by a dragon, but burst free from its stomach unharmed. This apparently makes her the ideal saint for women trying to force something large and angry out of a small and panicked place. You wish Margaret were here in person. You'd scream at her too. Finally, after what feels like years or maybe minutes, you push. You scream. You tear. The midwife's voice gets louder. The room turns to smoke. And then a cry. A real one. High, thin, unmistakably human. Your baby is here. You don't know if it's a boy or girl yet. You don't even care. You just want it to stop. The pain, the fire, the terrifying quiet afterward. But it's not over. Not yet. Because now comes the afterbirth, the part no one mentions in poetry. The bleeding, the stitching if there's any thread to spare. The prayers to stop the blood. the fear that something inside you didn't come out. And then there's the risk of puerperal fever, a deadly infection caused by poor hygiene. No one knows this yet, of course. They'll blame the devil, or your sin, or your mood. The baby is placed on your chest, warm, wet, breathing. You smile through the tears. You look up at the midwife. She doesn't smile back, because she's seen too many women smile for the last time. And if you're lucky enough to survive, there's still no rest. The church says you must be churched before rejoining the community. A purification rite. 40 days after birth for a boy, 80 for a girl. Yes, they made you wait longer if you birthed a girl. Because reasons. Until then, you're considered unclean, which is a nice way of saying you're kept in a room and no one touches you except to feed you broth. But at least you're alive, unlike Agnes from the next village who bled out in a hayloft, unlike Isolde, who died of infection 2 days later, unlike your aunt, whose baby was born blue and silent. You survived. This time, you hold the child closer. It's a girl. You name her quietly under your breath. No one has asked you yet. You don't wait for permission. You're shaking. The candle burns low. The midwife whispers to the baby now. A quiet prayer, maybe. A spell. Or perhaps a plea that you will survive long enough to raise her. Because in this world, one miracle doesn't promise the next. The baby is swaddled and asleep. Your thighs still ache. The straw mattress sticks to your skin. You've just given birth, but that doesn't mean the questions stop. Not the whispered ones from behind closed doors, and certainly not the ones asked loudly by your confessor. Have you resumed marital duties? You blink at him, lips dry. You're still bleeding, still sore. But he expects an answer. Because apparently, now that you've survived childbirth, it's time to think about intimacy again. And of course, God. In the Middle Ages, the church was deeply involved in the bedroom, not just in spirit, but in detail, very specific detail. You weren't just expected to love and obey. You were expected to perform, but only in the correct ways, on the correct days, and with the correct intentions. A priest might advise you and your husband on when to abstain: holy days, fasting days, Sundays, feast days, and yes, Wednesdays. He might also explain acceptable positions, spoiler only one, and offer guidance on everything from eye contact to thoughts during the act. Yes, even your imagination was regulated. A 12th century penitential guide instructed that marital union must be brief, silent, and focused solely on procreation. Any pleasure, especially for the woman, was seen as borderline sinful. One confessor warned that moaning was the devil's whisper slipping through the flesh. Let that ruin your mood for the next decade. And if you confessed to enjoying yourself, you could be assigned penance, days of fasting, extra prayers, walking barefoot to church, because heaven forbid you find joy in your own marriage. Historians still argue how strictly these rules were enforced. Some think they were mostly symbolic, reserved for monks and nuns writing manuals no one read. Others believe these ideas filtered deep into culture through sermons, confessions, and gossip. What's certain is that medieval people took these teachings seriously enough to record them in detail, which means someone somewhere was whispering this advice to a very uncomfortable couple in a cold stone room. There were even illustrated guides, yes, diagrams, circulating in some educated circles. They showed acceptable marital unions, often labeled with Latin phrases like onesta copulatio, honest coupling. Anything outside those boxes, sinful. dangerous, possibly French. And let's not forget fertility. The church preached that sex must always be open to procreation. If you were pregnant or postpartum or infertile, the rules got murky. Some priests allowed it, others forbade it. One particularly severe abbot claimed that to lie together while the womb rests is to invite rot. Rot. You wonder if any of these men ever actually spoke to a woman, but still, you follow the rules, or pretend to, because a bad reputation spreads fast, and no one wants to be labeled a hot-blooded wife. That's a term, by the way. Women seen as too interested in intimacy were suspected of being witches, seductresses, or worse, French again. Even your calendar was not your own. A popular 14th century guide listed over 160 days each year when married couples were forbidden from being intimate, leaving you with about 2 days a week, assuming you weren't tired, pregnant, or disgusted. So, instead of closeness, you get checklists. Instead of desire, doctrine. Even when you love him or want to, you find yourself navigating a maze of guilt and rules, hoping that tonight isn't a forbidden night and that your thoughts don't count as sin. Some women tried to carve out space for themselves. They claimed frequent illness or devoted themselves to saints. In one case, a noblewoman in Saxony insisted she had taken a vow of silence for Lent and simply could not respond to her husband's advances. He complained to a bishop. The bishop advised patience and more vegetables. Meanwhile, you keep your head down. You serve dinner. You light candles. You kiss your baby's forehead and pretend your back doesn't hurt. And when your husband touches your arm at night, you brace for impact, not from his hands, but from the thought that if you say no, you could be labeled a sinner, a rebel, a bad wife. Because even in your own bed, you are not in charge of your body. And the church, it's watching. From the pulpit, from the confessional, from the stained glass saints who peer down from above, frozen mid-blessing, while you silently count the days until you're allowed to say no again, or until you're brave enough to say it anyway. The first time he doesn't come home, no one says anything. Not his mother, not the steward, not the servant who clears away the untouched bread from your table. You sit alone, staring at the spot where he usually spills wine on the linen. The baby stirs in her cradle. The candle drips wax like a silent clock. At dawn, he returns smelling of wet stone and sweet perfume. You don't ask where he was. You already know. And so begins the next chapter of your marriage being a widow in waiting. Because whether you expect it or not in the Middle Ages, death is never far away. Especially for men who ride horses fast, carry swords casually, and drink until their hearts forget to beat. But if your husband dies, what happens to you? It depends. You might think widowhood offers freedom, and sometimes it does. You're no longer under your husband's direct control. You may not have to share a bed. You may even wear black, speak softly, and finally be allowed a room of your own. But the legal, social, and financial fallout, that's another story. Let's start with the basics: property. Unless your marriage contract was very specific, everything, your home, your land, even your clothing, reverts to your husband's family when he dies. You may be allowed a small dower, not dowry. This is different, a portion of his estate meant to sustain you. But even that is often contested. In England, the widow's third law allowed women 1/3 of their husband's land if no sons existed. Sounds fair, right? Until you realize that male relatives often contested it, dragging widows into court while they mourned. And yes, you could sue. You could hire clerks, plead your case, cry before the bishop. But most of the time, you lost. One widow in Normandy, after 25 years of marriage, was left with nothing but her husband's old cloak. She pawned it for bread, then was forced to return to her father's house if her father was still alive. Many weren't, and if you had children, they weren't always yours to keep. If your husband's family had power or money, they might claim your children as heirs of the household, removing them from your care. Especially sons. Especially if you were young enough to remarry, because a new husband might interfere with inheritance. Imagine giving birth after hours of screaming pain and being told a few years later that your son now belongs to his uncle. It happened. Often. Widowhood also came with moral expectations. You were supposed to be quiet, modest, devout. No laughter, no music. Certainly no remarriage without permission. In Florence, widows were forbidden from wearing jewelry for a year. In some Spanish towns, they had to live with chaperones in their own homes. And don't even think about having male visitors. There's a recorded case in 1387 of a young widow in Bruges who was seen laughing with her cousin in a courtyard. Gossip exploded. Within a week, she was dragged to a church tribunal and accused of moral impropriety. Her punishment, public penance and forced seclusion. All for smiling. But despite all this, widowhood could offer a rare, fragile kind of power. You were no longer expected to produce heirs. You couldn't be forced back into the bridal bed. If your husband had debts, they weren't automatically yours. And if you had managed to hold on to some property or funds, you could run your own household, something unthinkable for most married women. There's even a term used by scholars, femme sole, a woman on her own, legally recognized to make contracts hire servants, manage estates. One famous example is Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century Englishwoman, who after bearing 14 children, yes, 14, chose celibacy and spiritual devotion. She traveled, preached, dictated her memoirs, and lived largely independently, all after widowhood. But Marjorie was unusual. Most widows were not literate, not protected, not free. And of course, there was always the lurking pressure to remarry, especially if you were young, especially if you still had a decent dowry or a pretty face. Families would circle like hawks trying to pair you off again quickly before you became too independent or too poor. Some resisted. They joined convents. They hid with cousins. One English widow allegedly shaved her head and pretended madness until the suitor gave up. Others agreed reluctantly, knowing a second marriage might be less cruel than the poverty waiting at the door. And some, unfortunately, were forced, coerced by family, threatened by in-laws, married off like merchandise again. There are records of widows being dragged to the altar, bribed with food, or threatened with losing their children. Because even in grief, a woman's body and name were not her own. But there's another kind of widow too, the social widow. You don't need to lose your husband to live as though you had. Some women whose husbands took mistresses vanished to war or ignored them entirely, simply slipped into the role, dressed in gray, attended mass alone, slept in their own rooms. Slowly, quietly, they disappeared from their marriages while still technically in them. It was survival by stealth. So you fold your husband's cloak, you dust the frame of his portrait, You kiss your daughter's forehead and light a candle for Saint Monica, protector of suffering wives. And in the flicker of that small flame, you wonder, would widowhood be a curse? Or would it be the first true breath you've taken in years? You step carefully around the half-frozen puddle near the garden gate, clutching a basket of drying herbs. The air is cold and damp, and you whisper a quiet prayer that the baby doesn't catch another fever. Behind you, the door creaks shut and locks. Not with malice. With protection, they'll say. Because word has it, a girl in the next village was caught behind the stables with a boy and a bottle of honey wine. And now your daughter is 13, of age, of value, of danger. In the Middle Ages, girls were rarely treated as children once they reached puberty. Instead, they were considered eligible, which meant their movements were tracked, their speech corrected, and their futures decided often without them ever being asked. Welcome to the era of cloistered daughters' fertility charms and whispered curses. You keep your daughter inside more now, not because she's misbehaved, but because the world outside your door is full of eyes. Some watch with marriage in mind, others less nobly. One misplaced smile at market can set gossip swirling. And you know what gossip does to a girl. So you try to protect her the way your mother once tried to protect you, with ritual, with superstition, and with secrets. She wears a necklace of blue beads when she sleeps. You hang sprigs of dried vervain above her window tied with red twine. On certain feast days, you have her drink warm milk mixed with crushed basil and salt. It's supposed to quiet the womb. Do these things work? Historians still argue about whether medieval women believed fully in magic or used it symbolically. One camp insists these were spiritual rituals, acts of devotion in a world that lacked science. Another camp sees them as grassroots medicine born of necessity. And then there's the third camp, those who believe women knew exactly what they were doing, even if they never admitted it aloud. You fall somewhere in between, half hope, half habit. The charms, though, are very real. Midwives pass them quietly to mothers, like you, amulets of lead pendants carved from deer-bone sachets of herbs, meant to cool the blood or seal the door. Some even contain crushed insects, beetle shells, moth wings, powdered hornets wrapped in linen and worn under the dress. In parts of Germany, girls were told to walk backward over a threshold at sundown to ensure fertility only arrived when invited. In northern France, mothers whispered rhymes into their daughters' braids, believing words could wind their way into the womb like spells. And yet, despite all the effort, all the prayers, all the blood rituals, your daughter is still vulnerable. Because girls could be betrothed at 10, married at 12, and expected to bear children shortly after. The church officially encouraged later marriages 18, even 20, but in practice, poverty politics and patriarchy pushed girls into motherhood before they'd had a full set of teeth. In one disturbing case from 15th century Hungary, a nobleman married his bride at 12, then waited only 2 months before consummating the marriage. She died in childbirth the next year. Her gravestone read, "She was obedient and so favored by heaven." You want more than that for your daughter. So, you teach her the silences, how to nod without agreeing, how to excuse herself from a room without making noise, how to use illness as a shield. You don't call it training, but that's what it is. Even among women, there's danger. Older ladies who speak in sweet tones while probing for the size of her dowry. Spinsters who offer her berries and then remark how shapely she's grown. mothers who've already promised their sons to someone younger. You remember what it was like. You remember the first time you were weighed with the eyes. So you keep her hair tied back. You tell her to walk with her arms folded. You teach her the names of every plant in the garden, especially the bitter ones, because some of those plants are not for cooking. Among the many secrets midwives passed down were recipes for fertility and for avoiding it. Most were unreliable. But some, according to modern scholars, may have had some effect. Rue pennyroyal silphium, though now extinct, and even dried fig sap were used in tinctures and teas meant to delay conception or induce miscarriage. Dangerous, desperate, but real. Of course, these practices were illegal. The church denounced them as witchcraft. Women caught using such remedies could be excommunicated, imprisoned, or worse. But still, they endured, passed from mother to daughter in the hush between chores. And then there were the protective spells. You've seen them etched into the underside of a table, or scratched into the soft wax of a candle stub. Little charms meant to keep a daughter unseen. A fringe tradition from coastal Brittany involved baking a tiny salt doll, wrapping it in a square of wool, and burying it in the hearth ash to carry the girl's heat until the right man calls. You did this for your daughter last winter. It hasn't melted yet, but even you know you're fighting a rising tide. Soon, a suitor will come, with his goats, or his poetry, or his father's papers, and you'll have to look at your daughter and remember that in this world, a girl is a question that must be answered early. So, tonight you braid her hair slowly. You sing a lullaby your mother once sang to you. You tuck the blue beads beneath her shirt, and you whisper, not to God this time, but to whatever listens in the dark. Let her live long. Let her laugh often. And let her wedding night come as late as the stars will allow. The door is bolted, not to keep something out, but to keep you in. You sit in the corner of the hall, back pressed against the cold plaster wall, your hands folded tightly in your lap. The air smells of damp straw and vinegar. Your hair is unpinned, your face flushed from shame or fever, hard to tell which anymore. They've taken your combs, your ribbons, your shoes. You're barefoot. You haven't spoken in hours, not because you don't want to, but because no one will listen. Your crime. You refused your husband. You raised your voice. You said no. And now you're here on the floor of the manor's side room, which might as well be a cell. This is not a formal court. It's not even a church tribunal. It's something quieter, more private, more common, more frightening. A domestic trial. A judgment rendered not by bishops, but by family, neighbors, sometimes even by servants. They call it correction. In the Middle Ages, a wife could be disciplined by her husband for disobedience. This could mean anything from walking too slowly at market to questioning his decisions in public. And while the church officially urged gentle rule and practice, the line between correction and punishment was razor thin. You remember what started this. You suggested he stop drinking so much mead. You said it lightly, half a joke. He didn't laugh. The next day you were locked in this room. No food, no water, just silence and the growing awareness that you are being watched, not for safety, but for submission. Your mother-in-law visits once silently placing a folded cloth beside you. You unfold it and find a hair ribbon cut cleanly down the middle. A message. You don't cry. Not yet. Because this is not the worst it can get. There are stories passed between washerwomen and midwives. Stories of women shaved bald for being unruly. Hair in medieval thought was a symbol of virtue, especially for women. Long, covered, well-kempt hair meant obedience and modesty. But shave it. That was a punishment worse than beating, a public mark of shame. In one case from 14th century Flanders, a merchant's wife was accused of deliberate disrespect after she scolded her husband in front of a tanner. The husband had her hair cut off and forced her to sit outside the chapel steps until Mass ended. She never spoke out again. Other punishments were more subtle. Being forbidden to speak at dinner, being made to eat on the floor, having your name omitted during family prayers. It sounds petty, because it is, but it's effective. These acts chip away at a woman's sense of self. They reframe marriage not as a partnership, but as a hierarchy, a delicate balance of silence and survival. One fringe practice from Eastern Europe involved binding a wife's wrists at night with soft cloth to teach her stillness. Another involved hanging bells from her dress hem so her movement could be heard at all times. If the bells stopped, she was questioned. Historians still argue about how widespread these rituals were. Some insist they were local customs. Others claim they were exaggerated in moralist texts as cautionary tales. But women whispered them, remembered them, passed them on, because fear, even if not lived, is learned. And if you dared to fight back, then came the ultimate threat: repudiation. A husband could claim his wife was dangerous, defiant, possessed. He could seek annulment, or worse, exile her to a convent. Not as a nun that required consent, but as a sort of living prisoner. A repented woman. Your head would be shaved. Your name changed. You would live behind walls, not for holiness, but for convenience. There's a chilling example from 1374. A noblewoman in Brittany who refused to be corrected was declared mentally unstable by her husband and confined to a priory. She spent the last 20 years of her life copying psalms by hand. Not one was signed with her name, and yet, in all this, there are moments of resistance. Small ones, sharp ones. A wife who spits into her husband's cup when he's not looking. A girl who braids her hair into knots too tight to comb out without help. A woman who tells her daughter in a whisper, "You don't have to love him. Just live." These moments don't make it into the chronicles, but they mattered, because sometimes survival was the only rebellion left. Back in your corner, the candle flickers low. Your husband hasn't come, but the steward has. He says you may come out, that you will apologize, that you will behave. You stand slowly, every bone aching. You nod, but inside something hardens. Not hate, not yet. Just a quiet resolve. Because you know now what they fear. They fear your voice. They fear your choices. They fear that you, a woman, with nothing but a name and a bed, still possess a will. And that is the one thing they can't correct. The first time you see her, you nearly don't recognize her. She's walking fast, too fast for a lady wrapped in a dark wool cloak and clutching a bundle beneath her arm. Her hair is hidden, her head down, but there's something in her stride. Something determined. Something you haven't seen in a long time escape. You catch her eye just briefly, a flicker of familiarity. She used to live near the edge of the village, married off to an old butcher. No children, no laughter. One day she just vanished, and now she's back, but only to pass through. A runaway wife. You don't say a word. You just nod. She nods back, then she disappears into the trees. In the Middle Ages, wives who ran away were breaking the law. Marriage was legally binding. A woman who left her husband could be charged with abandonment theft if she took anything, or even heresy if she sought sanctuary in a convent without permission. And yet, they ran anyway. Some disguised themselves as servants, others as pilgrims. A few even dressed as men, not just for safety, but for freedom. One account from 15th century Burgundy tells of a woman who cut her hair, bound her chest, and worked as a stable boy for nearly 3 years before anyone discovered the truth. When she was finally found, she claimed she had fled an abusive marriage and felt safer with the horses than with her husband. She was whipped, but not returned, because even the authorities knew what was broken could not always be forced whole again. And some women ran to convents not for piety, but for protection. Cloisters were sacred spaces. Men could not simply storm in and retrieve their wives. If a woman could make it to the convent and convince the abbess she was genuine, she might be granted sanctuary. Sometimes this meant she had to take vows. Sometimes it didn't. Some abbesses quietly, discreetly let women stay as guests for years, safe within stone and scripture. Of course, not. All escapes were dramatic. Some were quiet rebellions. You hear stories whispered at market, a baker's wife who poisons her husband's ale with just enough hemlock to keep him asleep for 3 days. A shepherd's bride who hides her dowry coins beneath a loose floorboard, waiting for the right moment to slip away. One legend, part folk tale, part court record, tells of a miller's daughter who faked her death using pig's blood and a borrowed shroud. Her family buried a stone-filled coffin and she rode off with a traveling musician. They were caught 5 years later. No one blamed them. Historians still debate how widespread these escape attempts were. Some say they were rare. Others argue that court records only reflect the failures, not the ones who succeeded and were never seen again. What's certain is this: for a woman to flee her marriage, she had to give up everything: name, family, safety, sometimes even her children. There's one haunting line in a 14th century letter from a runaway wife to her sister. I miss them every morning, but I do not miss the bruises. Not all women ran far. Some simply disappeared into the same town, changing their names, working as laundresses or healers or seamstresses in another part of the city. A few found other women to live with. Some joined up with bands of pilgrims and just kept walking. And yes, some found love again. Secret lovers, other outcasts, even nuns who had left their orders and carved new lives together in shadowy corners of the world. You remember your grandmother telling you about a woman who lived in the woods for years, selling herbs and telling fortunes. People called her a witch. She had once been a wife. It's all connected. The hair you can't cut, the bed you can't leave, the name you can't change, and the one truth that hides behind every rule they never expected you to want more. Which is why when a woman disappears, the village always whispers in shock. Why would she leave? She had food, a roof, a husband, as if those things are the same as peace, as if safety is all a woman should want, as if breathing isn't different when no one owns your name. Back at home, you run your hand along the seam of your own bodice. You've stitched 3 silver coins into the lining. You're not sure why. Habit, maybe? Hope. And in the hearth, ash tucked deep behind the copper pot, sits a parcel. Dried meat. A wool cloak. A map. You're not planning anything. Not today. But you like knowing it's there. Because even if you never run, even if your steps stay small and safe, there's power in the possibility. And that possibility, the dream of the road of trees, without eyes of freedom, without consequence, that might be the most dangerous thing of all. You lie awake again, not because of the cold, not because of the crying baby, not because of the ache in your back or the creaking of the shutters in the wind. You lie awake because the house is quiet, and that is the scariest sound of all. Because in the quiet, the whispers begin, not from outside, from memory. Every word ever said to you on the way to this bed, every warning, every rule, every hushed conversation between older women who had learned to live with less and speak even less than that. You remember the first time you were told what to expect from marriage, not by your mother, not by a priest, but by the baker's wife. She had pulled you aside and whispered, "Don't be too kind. Don't be too clever. Don't be too loud." And you had laughed. You're not laughing now, because lying in the dark, curled beneath rough linen, you realize what they were really saying. Be invisible. It's safer. This is the final fear that lingered over every medieval bride. Not the ghosts that rattled outside the walls, not the demons preachers warned you about, but the truth that once you crossed the threshold into marriage, you vanished. Your name became his. Your voice became a whisper. Your story became a chapter in his family's book, written by other hands. And your body? Well, that was no longer a question anyone asked you about. You were to bleed to birth, to serve, to obey. And if you did all of this quietly, respectfully, properly, perhaps you'd be remembered kindly. Perhaps. But even that depended on luck. And yet women found ways to live between the rules. They hid letters in wall cracks. They carved their names into pews where no one would look. They taught their daughters to read, not aloud, not in public, but quietly, between stitching seams. And they listened to each other, because if there's one truth beneath all the ash and silence and small stitched rebellions, it's this: the women remembered. The stories weren't written in books. They were braided into hair, baked into loaves, wrapped in talismans, sung low under breath, while grinding barley. They were passed down not as history, but as warning and survival. You remember a tale told to you once, late at night, about a bride who cried so much before her wedding that her tears filled her shoes. She was mocked. But years later, when her husband died, she wore those same shoes to his funeral and never shed another tear. You don't know if it's true. It doesn't matter. What matters is that someone told it, and someone believed it, and someone carried it on. And so here you are. The fire has gone out. The cradle is quiet. Your husband snores softly turned away. And you lie in the dark, not broken, not ruined, not gone, just waiting. Because maybe in the morning, you will rise again. You'll teach your daughter the safe words, the quiet ones, and maybe a few dangerous ones too. You'll write a name into the corner of your apron hem. You'll remember the herbs that do more than flavor soup. And when the time comes, whether tomorrow or next spring, or in the silence between two very careful breaths, you will know that you are not the only one who feared the wedding night more than any ghost. Because the ghosts were imaginary. But the silence was very real. And you're learning to speak beneath it. So now, as the final candles flicker low and the room settles into its soft breath of shadows, let's slowly let go of this long night behind us. The whispers that once haunted the corners of your mind begin to fade. You've heard their secrets, walked their narrow halls, felt their weight, but they do not follow you here. Not now. You are safe. The cold stone floors, the rough linen sheets, the long corridors of expectation all dissolve into stillness. In their place is quiet, a different quiet than before, one not shaped by fear, but by peace. You let your shoulders relax, your hands unclench. The silence around you now is gentle like the hush of snowfall in the woods or the soft flutter of curtain lace in a summer breeze. You are not in a manor. You are not under judgment. You are in your own space now, your breath deep, your thoughts slow. You are wrapped not in duty, but in stillness. And perhaps somewhere just past sleep, a dream waits. One where your name is your own. One where the door is open. One where no one watches the bed, but the stars. You've made it through the story. You've made it through the night. And now, you can rest. Close your eyes. Let the ghosts keep walking. They're not here for you anymore. Sweet dreams.